And you can't hold me to just being a nice little Mexican that only plays mariachi music. I mean, there's a lot of beauty in that, but it's not for me.
There's a question that comes up again and again whenever people talk to Carlos Santana about his guitar playing. Where did that sound come from? How did a kid from Outland de Navarro in Mexico end up creating one of the most recognizable guitar tones in the history of rock music? And every time the question comes up, Santana gives an answer that surprises people because he doesn't talk about technique or theory or practice routines. He talks about people, specific guitarists who taught him, without ever sitting in a room with him most of the time, what it actually means to play from the heart instead of just playing well. Santana has never been shy about naming these influences. Over the decades, in interview after interview, he keeps coming back to the same small group of players, almost like a private list he carries around with him everywhere he goes. What's interesting is that this list doesn't look like what you'd expect from a rock guitarist. There's no neat little box of rock influences. Instead, you get blues players, a jazz guitarist, a country picker, a flamenco musician, and the one name everybody assumes will be there, sitting right alongside players that most casual fans have never even heard of. That mix tells you something important about how Santana actually listens to music, and it's worth slowing down and looking at each piece of it. Start with the blues, because that's really the soil that everything else grew out of for Santana. When most people think about Chicago blues, two names jump out immediately: Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf. They're the giants, the names that get stamped onto the whole genre. But if you actually sit down with musicians who grew up inside that tradition, a different name tends to come up, a name that doesn't get nearly enough credit from the wider public: Otis Rush. Rush played left-handed, which already made his sound different, because he literally strung his guitar upside down rather than learning to play a normal right-handed instrument backwards. That physical difference changed the way he bent strings, the way the notes rang out, the whole feel of his playing. But the upside-down guitar is really just a detail. What actually mattered to Santana was the rawness underneath it. Rush didn't play the blues like he was demonstrating a skill. He played like a man confessing something he couldn't keep inside any longer. Every bent note sounded like it cost him something. That idea that a guitar solo should feel like a confession rather than a performance became one of the bedrock principles Santana built his whole career on. You don't play guitar to show people what you can do. You play guitar to show people what you feel, and you trust that if you feel it strongly enough, they'll feel it too. If Otis Rush represents the foundation, B.B. King represents the discipline built on top of that foundation. Santana has a nickname for King that says everything you need to know about how much respect he has for the man. He calls him the chairman of the board. Not just a great blues guitarist, the guy who sat at the head of the entire table for 50 straight years, never losing his grip on what made his playing special. And what made B.B. King's playing special wasn't speed, and it wasn't complexity. It was restraint. King could make a single note hang in the air with so much feeling in it that it landed harder than 100 notes played by a lesser player. Santana absorbed that lesson early, and it stayed with him for his whole life. Less can be more, as long as the less is loaded with real emotion. When you listen to a Santana guitar solo, especially the slow, aching ones, you're hearing B.B. King's lesson playing out in real time, decades later, filtered through a completely different cultural background, but carrying the exact same message. A note only matters if you mean it. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because the third blues-adjacent name that belongs in this conversation isn't really a blues player at all, and that's exactly the point. Chet Atkins was a country guitarist from Tennessee, a fingerpicker known for clean, precise, melodic playing that has almost nothing in common, on the surface, with Chicago blues or psychedelic rock. And yet, Santana has talked about Atkins with the same kind of reverence he gives to the blues giants. Why? Because Santana doesn't actually organize music by genre in his head. He organizes it by touch, by intention, by whether or not every single note sounds like it was chosen on purpose rather than landed on by accident. Chet Atkins had that quality in spades, regardless of what style he happened to be playing in, and Santana heard it instantly. There's a nice connection here too, because when Santana has talked about his old friend Jerry Garcia, he's pointed out that there was a strong streak of Chet Atkins running through Garcia's playing, that careful, purposeful way of moving through a melody, almost like a kid carefully working his way up and down the neck, finding exactly the right note instead of just sliding past it. That observation isn't something you could make unless you'd really studied Adkins's playing closely, and it shows that Santana's appreciation for Adkins isn't a throwaway compliment. It's a deeply considered part of his musical worldview, even though Adkins's name rarely comes up when people list off rock guitar influences. Speaking of Jerry Garcia, this is probably the most personal relationship on the whole list, because unlike most of the names here, Garcia wasn't just a record Santana listened to growing up. They knew each other, they played together, and Santana has written about Garcia with a level of detail and affection that he doesn't really extend to anyone else on this list, with the possible exception of B.B. King. What Santana loved about Garcia was his complete refusal to stay inside a single box. Most blues musicians, Santana has pointed out, are actually pretty conservative once you get past the surface. They find a style that works, and they stay inside it. Garcia did the opposite. He had blues running through his playing, sure, but he also had bluegrass in there, and old-time American folk music, and Indian classical influences, and country twang, and psychedelic exploration, all blended together into something that didn't belong fully to any single tradition. Santana has described playing alongside Garcia as an almost effortless conversation, where Garcia would float one direction and Santana would move in another direction entirely, and somehow the two guitar lines would still make complete musical sense together. And there's a beautiful image Santana has used to describe Garcia's soloing style. He said it was like Garcia was threading beads onto a string, one note carefully placed after another, building toward something, rather than just throwing the beads around the room in a random scatter. That's a guitarist with purpose, weaving freedom and structure together, rather than treating them as opposites. And that's exactly the lesson Santana took from him. Jump now to a completely different musical world, the world of flamenco, and you find one of the most surprising choices on Santana's whole list. If you ask most people to name a great flamenco guitarist, they'll say Paco de Lucia. And for good reason. He's probably the most technically dazzling flamenco player who ever lived. But when Santana talks about his own favorite flamenco guitarist, he doesn't pick de Lucia. He picks a much lesser-known player named Manitas de Plata, a self-taught Romani guitarist born in southern France, who never went through any formal musical training at all. What drew Santana to de Plata wasn't precision. It was fire. De Plata played like the music was bursting out of him whether he wanted it to or not. Like it wasn't a performance choice, but something closer to a biological need. Growing up in Mexico, Santana had Spanish guitar traditions woven into his childhood from an early age, so when he encountered De Plata's playing, he wasn't hearing flamenco as a polished art form performed in a concert hall. He was hearing flamenco as something closer to a force of nature, raw and untamed. Exactly the kind of thing that aligns with Santana's lifelong belief that music exists to move people physically and emotionally, not to impress them with technical skill. That belief that the goal of music is to make the body and the soul respond together, not separately, runs through everything Santana has ever recorded, and you can trace a direct line back to the kind of unrestrained, instinctive playing he heard in De Plata. Now let's talk about jazz, because Santana's relationship with jazz guitar runs through one specific player, Wes Montgomery. Santana has used a wonderful comparison to describe what it felt like hearing Montgomery for the first time. He compared it to climbing inside a Rolls-Royce. Not because Montgomery played fast or aggressive solos, but because of the sheer smoothness and confidence of his playing, the sense that you were being carried somewhere beautiful by someone who knew exactly where he was taking you and never once doubted the route. There's a detail Santana likes to point to when he explains why Montgomery matters so much. John Coltrane, widely considered the greatest saxophonist in the history of jazz, wanted Wes Montgomery in his band. Think about what that means. The single greatest figure in jazz saxophone looked across the entire musical landscape and decided this particular guitarist was the one he wanted standing next to him. That alone should end any debate about where Montgomery belongs in the conversation about great guitarists. What Santana took from Montgomery wasn't a specific technique, even though Montgomery was famous for his thumb-picking style and his use of octaves. What Santana actually absorbed was a bigger idea, that a guitar could be sophisticated and emotionally direct at the same time, that you didn't have to choose between playing something harmonically complex and playing something that reaches straight into a listener's chest. Montgomery proved those two things could live in the same note, and Santana has spent his whole career trying to prove the exact same thing. And then, finally, there's Jimi Hendrix, the name everybody expects to find at the top of this list, and for good reason. Santana was there at Woodstock, young, barely known at the time, standing backstage and watching Hendrix completely reinvent what an electric guitar was capable of doing. That moment didn't just impress Santana. It confirmed something he already suspected deep down, that a guitar, played at the absolute highest and most fearless level, could change a person standing in a crowd into someone who would never hear music the same way again. Santana has talked about Hendrix again and again across decades of interviews, often placing him alongside B.B. King and the jazz trumpeter Miles Davis as the standard he measures his own playing against every single time he steps onto a stage. What Hendrix did in Santana's eyes was turn the electric guitar into a complete world rather than a single tool, not just a lead instrument for solos, not just a rhythm instrument for backing up a song, but something that contained rhythm, melody, texture, noise, beauty, and chaos all happening at once, controlled by someone who seemed to be operating outside the normal rules everyone else followed. The feedback wasn't a mistake to be avoided. The whammy bar wasn't a gimmick. All of it was the music itself, woven together into one continuous voice. Santana has talked about Hendrix not just as a brilliant guitarist, but as something closer to a spiritual force, a musician who understood that the instrument in his hands was a vehicle for something much bigger than entertainment. That idea that the guitar can be a doorway to something spiritual rather than just a tool for making sound has guided Santana's entire career, and he's been chasing the understanding Hendrix first showed him for more than 50 years now. When you step back and look at this whole group of names together, Otis Rush, B.B. King, Chet Atkins, Jerry Garcia, Manitas de Plata, Wes Montgomery, and Jimi Hendrix, what jumps out isn't the differences between their styles. It's the thread running underneath all of them. None of these players got picked because of speed or flash or technical complexity for its own sake. Every single one of them got picked because they played with total commitment, because every note they touched seemed chosen rather than accidental, and because their playing connected to something underneath the music rather than staying on the surface of it. That's the actual lesson hiding inside Santana's list, and it's a lesson that goes well beyond guitar playing. It doesn't matter what genre you work in. It doesn't matter whether you're trained in a conservatory or self-taught in a family tradition passed down through generations. What matters is whether you mean what you're doing. Santana built an entire 50-year career out of that one belief, and every time he names these 7 guitarists, he's really just explaining, piece by piece, where that belief came from and why he's never once let go of it.